Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, indeed it is a great honor for me to welcome you to this Professorial Inaugural Lecture of Professor Alex Broadbent, who, in addition of being a professor of the University of Johannesburg, is also the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities. As I was coming here, I went to Facebook and I saw a picture of the Dean of Engineering written, "The best Dean of Engineering at the inaugural lecture of the best Dean of Humanities in the country." In particular, I wish to express a warm welcome to Professor Broadbent's family, his mother, Mrs. Rosalind Broadbent, his wife Nicole, his mother-in-law Penny, his father-in-law Peter, and other relatives, his special guests and colleagues. This is indeed a proud and joyful moment, especially for the University of Johannesburg, and I am sure all of you, as it is for Professor Broadbent. Inaugurations, we are told, date back to the ancient Greece as the opportunity for the formal investiture of a person into high office. And indeed, being a professor is a high office. It marks the formal assumption of the position of authority. And sometimes we tend to forget that the opinions of our professors actually matter. And if such opinions are not well thought, they can actually misguide a whole society. And so today is that day that marks the rites of passage and the entry of Professor Broadbent into the distinguished community of UJ's most senior scholars. This is just symbolic. He is already a member of our distinguished community of our senior scholars, but we just never had time to have a ceremony. And tonight is actually the formalization of that. It is indeed an office and a position of authority and leadership which should never be assumed lightly and should be approached with careful reflection, deliberation, and the presence of mind. It is true to say that one of the reasons we celebrate such lectures is linked to the fact that it attests to the role of higher education as a vehicle for positive transformation of society. Because if not carefully approached, it can also have a negative influence on society. And we have historical evidence where academia was used as a political tool to advance a particular agenda. And this, at the University of Johannesburg, we aspire to be as far from as possible the destruction of society, the use of knowledge to destroy society. Finally, I am mindful that delivering an inaugural lecture is a somewhat daunting experience. But Professor Broadbent, with his impressive educational pedigrees, I am sure is not finding this a daunting experience. So with these few words, let me now invite the registrar, Professor Kinta Berger, to formally introduce Professor Broadbent.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Marwala and colleagues here, family and friends, and ladies and gentlemen, it is a pleasure to introduce Professor Alex Broadbent to you. Alex Broadbent is Professor of Philosophy and Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities here at the University of Johannesburg. Previously, he held various research, teaching, and visiting positions at Cambridge, Vienna, Athens, and Harvard, before joining the University of Johannesburg in 2011. Alex is a philosopher of science with particular interest in philosophy of epidemiology, philosophy of medicine, and philosophy of law, connected by the philosophical themes of causation, explanation, and prediction. He's committed to finding philosophical problems in practical context and to contributing something useful concerning them. He holds a P rating from the National Research Foundation of South Africa for the period 2013 to 2018, and is also a member of the South African Young Academy of Sciences. He has published a number of articles in top international journals across 3 disciplines, namely philosophy, epidemiology, and law. His first book, Philosophy of Epidemiology, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2013 and has been translated in Korean. His second book, Philosophy for Graduate Students, Metaphysics and Epistemology, was published by Routledge in 2016, and is currently working on his third book, Philosophy of Medicine, under contract with Oxford University Press. Alex believes that academic leadership in the contemporary university calls for academic as well as leadership qualities, and thus believes that it's both desirable and possible to be a scholar dean. His core belief is that in the space created by real academic inquiry, people always enter each interaction as equals, with their status determined entirely by the merit of their contribution. Alex believes in the power of critical inquiry to free people from their backgrounds and from their preconceptions of others, and to open new lines of thought, to literally change one's mind. Alex believes in the power of ideas, which shape how we behave and thus shape the world. Humanities disciplines all share the thread of critical engagement with ideas, and Alex's hope for the future of the humanities in this university and beyond is that they will learn how to more effectively bring their special perspectives to bear on the important ideas of our times, wherever those ideas come from. Ladies and gentlemen, Prof. Alex Broadbent. Thank you.
So I want to just say all protocol acknowledged. I'd like to acknowledge the Deputy Vice Chancellor, the Registrar, whoever's from other members of the Executive Leadership Group. I also would like in particular to acknowledge my family members who are present. So my mother and her partner Brian are there. I can see there's my wife, Nicole. She's dying to point her out. And for all my friends, and I also want to say thank you to anybody who's taken the trouble to watch this on YouTube after the fact. And thanks, I'm not going to name everybody, but thank you so much for showing up. I'm very proud and grateful. I found this university an extremely stimulating and enjoyable place and supportive place to work and to develop, and I'm genuinely very grateful and honoured to be standing here, giving an inaugural address as a professor of the university. In early modern times, Spanish ports were famed for being hotbeds of disease because travellers came from all over. And people who survived in those towns, I mean, visitors would just die. People who survived became kind of immunological supermen. I feel I'm in the process of becoming an immunological superman because I have a toddler in school. And this week we're all suffering from influenza B. So my apologies if my throat gives out halfway through, and also don't come too close. So, thank you so much. I just want to give you a little bit of background, sort of intellectual background, to what I sort of do, what I think about. I have a sort of commitment to useful philosophy, as was mentioned. My main claim to fame is philosophy of epidemiology. Epidemiology is the science that studies the spread of diseases through populations. There's a broader field, which is the field of philosophy of medicine. And its development is patchy, and indeed one of the ways in which its development is patchy is a lack of attention to epidemiology, which I've worked on. But what I'm doing is now looking at other bits of philosophy of medicine that might be, where there might be things to say. So this is a talk of new stuff. I don't know whether one is supposed to do that as an inaugural or whether you're supposed to just do the stuff you've done before. But anyway, that's what this is. I'm trying some things out. Why philosophy of medicine? Why? I mean, it might sound like a contradiction in terms. Medicine is a very practical thing, it might seem. Philosophy of medicine, I mean, what is that? Well, for me, I think that medical decisions are actually among the toughest epistemic challenges most of us have to make. If you think about, unless you're a detective or something, which I take it most of you are not, most people in their daily lives don't have to, they don't have to think about how they know stuff. If you make a decision about which phone you're going to use or buy or something, you're going to rely on reviews and on your budget, and there's not a serious doubt. But with medicine, that's not the case. If you're choosing a course of treatment or anything of that sort, it's a serious epistemic challenge, and it's quite hard to know what to do. And that's because medicine remains controversial and contested. It's not the case that it's some sort of settled, compare it to, the technology of transport. I mean, it's pretty clear what works and what doesn't, depending on what you desire in that context. And medicine remains controversial, and medical expertise remains controversial. So, which expert are you supposed to trust? Are you supposed to trust the expert surgeon, the expert homeopath, the expert chiropractor, the expert sangoma? They may be making different recommendations. And if you expand the field to not just medical treatment, but just generally health-related behaviours, it gets even worse. I mean, should you be banting, or should you be, eating your legumes? Or I mean, it gets extremely confusing. And of course, everybody proclaiming one of these things, proclaims it as an expert. So for me, that's one of the fundamental, at least the fundamental reasons why medicine is philosophically interesting, is that it presents this huge epistemic challenge in our ordinary lives. So I've got a big question and a focused question. I've got some students here who this is what I usually do. So the big picture question, then a focused version of it. The big question is, what is medicine? There's lots of things there's lots of ways you could take this, but one obvious kind of answer is to say, well, medicine is the business of curing sick people. I'm going to deny that. In this talk, I'm going to deny that medicine is the business of curing sick people. And here's the starting point for that. It's a quote from a historian of medicine, Roy Porter, who says, "The prominence of medicine has lain only in small measure in its ability to make the sick well. This was always true and remains so today. So the prominence of medicine, the place it holds in society, doesn't really have much to do with its ability to make the sick well." That's his remark. And actually, if you look at the history of medicine, for most of the history of medicine, it's really been very bad at curing people. It's not been very good at all at curing people. Not just sort of moderate success, it's really almost no success. And yet, even so, throughout history, we've had doctors. We've had, in all societies, ever since we stopped being nomads 10,000 years ago. Before that, we were much more likely to abandon our sick. But then we formed agricultural communities. We started catching more diseases from the animals and so forth that we were keeping, and we became less well nourished and so forth. And we couldn't any longer abandon our sick, and we started having doctors as well as diseases. So, if they're experts, if these medical experts are experts, then what are they experts in if not curing people? Maybe it's just duping people. Maybe we're all stupid and mistaken, and it's all a giant con. And that's a conclusion that I'm aware that probably there are quite a lot of people who are attracted to that. But I'm going to try and resist that conclusion as well. So here's my focused question. I said I had a big question. My focused question, the way I'm going to take that question is this. What is the core medical competence? What is it that doctors are good at doing that distinguishes them from a kindly relative? The doctor is like the kindly relative. They all want to make you better, but the kindly relative brings you tea and slippers. But that doesn't qualify the kindly relative as a doctor. The mere desire to make you better. So it can't be the purpose with which they're acting. It's something that they're capable of doing. So what is the core medical competence? So this is how I'm going to proceed. I'm going to say a little bit more about the curative thesis. The idea is just introduced that the medical competence is curing people. Core medical competence is curing people. I'm going to argue or relate a historical argument that medicine mostly lacks cures. I'm going to suggest that what medicine provides instead of cure is understanding. I'm going to mention a few things that I think mainstream medicine can't explain. I'll explain why I'm doing that as we go along. And then I'm going to distinguish intellectual and practical competences. I'm going to say the core intellectual competence is understanding, the core practical competence is prediction. So the curative thesis is the thesis I just mentioned, the claim that the core medical competence is curing sick people. This is what doctors are good for. This is what they do. By cure, I don't mean a kind of complete miracle, wonderful, as if it never happened, you're back to where you were. What I mean is just any intervention that's reasonably effective at alleviating the suffering of disease. But this, this would make my talk a lot easier for me, because it's very easy to show that medicine doesn't do that. But that's an unreasonably high standard, I think, to set. So I just want to say any really reasonably effective intervention. And that's going to include things you wouldn't normally think of as a cure. So it's going to include perhaps insulin for diabetics and painkillers and so forth. By core medical competence, I mean a skill set that is characteristic of the medical, defines the medical. So it doesn't have to be possessed by every single practitioner. It's not the case that every single doctor has to have this skill set. In fact, in mainstream contemporary medicine, the division of labor is extreme. So somebody, I slip the disc, they scan me. The person who reads the scan is not the orthopedic surgeon. You need a special set of skills even to diagnose on the basis of the scan. So there's a highly distributed system in contemporary hospital medicine. And nor need it correspond with anyone's purpose, either the overall purpose of the profession. Maybe the purpose of the profession is indeed to make people better. And indeed, maybe the purpose of doctors is just to make money and they don't care about making people. I mean, the thing they're good at doesn't have to correspond with their purpose in any particular way. So I'm quite happy to accept the point of medicine, the purpose of medicine, is to try and make people better. My point is that what doctors do isn't that, in most cases. So medicine mostly lacks cures. I'm going to look first at Western medicine up to the 19th century, particularly the 19th century, very briefly. So, there was a tradition that grew up in Europe, starting in the Renaissance, had its roots in ancient Greece and so forth, and that tradition is what sort of leads to what you find in hospitals now. But that tradition, up until the 19th century, was remarkably poor at curing people. It made great progress in understanding anatomy and pathology. We discovered the circulation of blood, eventually discovered microorganisms and so forth. Our understanding improved a great deal. Our ability to cure people didn't really proceed very much at all, right through the 19th century. So this is a quote from Roy Porter again. He's one of my main sources in this. I just like this. Primary care's options were limited, since before the 20th century, the pharmacopoeia resembled a box of blanks. True cures remained elusive, and doctors knew their prescriptions were largely eyewash. This dismal situation was somewhat allayed by the fact that church-going folk did not expect the family doctor to perform miracles, and, living in a vale of tears, they were inured to the constant round of funerals. So here it paints a very, very dim picture. And this picture, his comment on this picture is, so this is a doctor looking at a sick child, looking on, and not really got any kit, he's not really doing anything. He's just looking on sympathetically, compassionately, and just watching. And, you know, knows what's happening but can't do anything about it. And the point that Porter makes about this is that the tone of this whole painting is sympathetic. So the tone of the painting is not critical of the doctor. It's just, well, you know, that's the way it is. Here's another quote from a 19th century, and the previous one wasn't a quote from a 19th century person, it was about the 19th century. This is a quote from a famous 19th century person. I don't see the Dean of Health Sciences here, but this is the counterpart of the Dean of Health Sciences at Harvard in 1860, the Dean of the Medical School there. If the whole materia medica as now used could be sunk to the bottom of the sea, it would be all the better for mankind, and all the worse for the fishes. It's a famous, he's got a bunch of quotes, so that's a famous one. So, so I'm going to take it as fairly clear that, you know, until right through the end of the 19th century, that there was not, in Western European medicine and then in America, there really wasn't much curative power. I'm not saying it's valueless, and in fact that's the point of my talk. I'm just saying that it didn't have the ability to intervene and improve people's health when they got ill. And I don't see evidence that any other traditions were notably better. So, you know, sure, it may be that in some particular areas, or for some particular things, or for some particular conditions, or in some particular recommendations, some traditions did better than others. But I don't think it's the case that, you know, Chinese medicine had it all nailed and the European medicine didn't, or something like that. I just simply don't see evidence for that. But what about after the 20th century? So in the early 20th century, there's no doubt there were dramatic curative discoveries in medicine. So you have antibiotics, you have cortisone, you've got penicillin, anesthesia, which, as I'm suggesting, is an important, in a sense, curative, in the sense it's effective. You've got vaccination, partly due to anesthesia and partly due to the ability to control infection. You've got a huge increase in surgery. Does anybody know why this is here? I know Tia the vet probably does. Anybody else? A couple of you. So, sir, I tempted to call on some of those people who put their hands up. I bet you've got some bluffers in there. So this is a barber's sign. The barbers used to perform surgery. Barber surgeon is the full name. And this pole, the reason this is the barber's symbol is that when they were in the marketplace, they would have a red and white pole like this, because to indicate their presence in the marketplace. This being blood, they performed bloodletting. So, you know, the two professions separated, but for a long time surgery was not the pinnacle of medicine at all. It wasn't even part of medicine. It was considered to be a sort of barbaric, you know, low status thing, and it was indeed pretty barbaric. I mean, it was brutal in many cases, extremely painful, obviously. So the nature of medicine changed as well, and it moved into the public domain. It used to be largely a private transaction, and the growth of the nation state and the wars that accompanied that brought it into the public domain. And this tradition that was Western grew globally, spread globally. Hence, I don't think it's really right to call it Western medicine. And that's why, for what I've been talking about now, I talk about mainstream medicine. And it is a unique tradition among medical traditions because of its global presence, which others simply haven't had historically or currently, and because it's perceived as being uniquely effective, and for that reason it attracts state support and state regulation in a way that others simply don't. So it makes sense to ask, if I'm going to deny that medicine is the core medical competence is curing people, it makes sense for me to ask, does the curative thesis perhaps apply to this? It may have not applied to all the rubbish in the past, whatever, but surely it applies to our current, you know, best, whatever, most scientific, whatever honorific term you'd like to use. So is the curative thesis true of mainstream medicine? Well, again, I don't think it is. I don't think the core medical competence, even of, you know, our best contemporary hospital medicine is curative. There are lots of things, obviously, that we can't cure. Most cancer, a lot of heart disease. I mean, you know, the whole of psychiatry. I mean, you know, we simply can't do anything about most mental illnesses, or at least, but we can do very, very little. You know, suicide is a top 10 killer in the United States. That's not a success story. A lot of back pain. We're simply, you know, we just, you know, we have interventions, but they're not terribly effective. Migraines, diabetes, we can do something, but it's not great. Asthma, you know, we can control it sometimes, but not universally. The common cold, we still can't do anything about. HIV/AIDS, well, we're a lot better off than we were, but we still don't have something that. I mean, you know, being better off than we were isn't the same as actually curing. And generally, viruses in general, we have a muted success at best. So, what I'm not saying that we can't do anything about these things. I'm not saying that these are all disasters, but also I don't think there's, you know, huge success stories. We can do something sometimes. So some diabetes can be managed with insulin, some asthma can be controlled with inhalers, some back pain can be ameliorated with surgery or painkillers. I mean, and so forth. And when I slipped my disc, painkillers didn't really help. So it's not universal. The point is these ailments still sometimes resist our best efforts. So it's a kind of an argument of degree. But my point is not really, I'm not rubbishing medicine here. That's not the objective. The point I'm trying to make is that even though we don't have the greatest curative success here, we still have medical experts in these things. So we still have medical experts in oncology and cardiology and psychiatry. And, you know, those experts clearly aren't experts in curing, because we don't have very many cures in those areas. So there are many areas of medicine that specialize in things that can't be cured. Perhaps those are our most important areas of medicine in many ways. That's what makes them important. Another quote from Porter, this was about the 19th century. Elite medical professors could espouse a grim therapeutic nihilism. Medicine could understand the diseases from which people would die, but not stop them from dying. And this is perhaps still applicable for some of the most, the most feared and the most intractable diseases. So let me formalize what I've been saying a bit. The expert argument. If the curative thesis were true, then one could not be a medical expert without curative competence. I've given an alternative version in case people object to this one. Alternatively, you could say then there could not be a field of medical expertise without curative competence. However, one can be a medical expert without curative competence, or alternatively, there can be a field of medical expertise without curative competence, therefore the curative thesis is false. That's the structure of my argument so far. So you might, from here, you might think, well, that's just a mitigated disaster. And this is roughly what a friend of mine, Jacob Stegenga, espouses in a book that is not yet published, but will be published quite soon. He calls medical nihilism the view that we should have little confidence in the effectiveness of medical interventions. And he's got lots of clever arguments about research methods and how malleable they are, and finance can, financial interests can push them around, and so forth. And I largely accept a lot of what he says, but I don't share his conclusion that medical nihilism is warranted. So I agree that some degree of therapeutic nihilism may be warranted. It may be that we should admit that at least in some areas, it's still the case that our efforts to cure are largely failures. That may be correct. But I don't think you can conclude from that medicine as a whole is a failure, unless you assume that the core competence of medicine is to cure. So, and of course that's what I'm denying. So I'm denying, in other words, that you have to be a medical nihilist if you're a therapeutic nihilist. There's an alternative reaction to the observation that we've had at best a mixed success with cure, which is to look for something else that, that medicine offers or does. So, what competences might distinguish the medical profession, given that cure is not one of them? What troubles me about Jacob's conclusion is that it doesn't explain what, why we draw a distinction between, somebody who's an expert oncologist and somebody who's just a kindly relative. I mean, why do we draw that distinction? And it seems to me that we must draw that distinction because of something that the oncologist is good at doing, is good at. So that's what I'm looking for. So my suggestion then is that what the medical experts are good at is understanding. So think about how a doctor convinces you that they're a medical expert. It's by showing that they understand what's wrong with you. So suppose, I hurt my finger or something, and it starts hurting, it goes a funny colour, I go see the doctor says, no, there's nothing to do about that. It's going to go green and it's going to fall off in 3 days' time, and then it'll be better. I might go for a second opinion because I might just want to be sure that really there's nothing to be done. But suppose I can get that second opinion, and in fact, all the finger experts agree that this finger disease is of that nature and so forth. So what will happen is I'll be upset, obviously, about the finger, but I won't think that person is not a doctor or not an expert. In fact, the expert may be able to exactly explain why they can't cure the finger. As is the case with explaining why HIV is a hard virus to tackle. I mean, that you can often explain exactly why it's difficult to do anything about it. And it's the demonstration of understanding that separates the doctor from a well-meaning relative who isn't a doctor. And I know some of you have relatives who are doctors, and I'm sure they're also well-meaning. So this is an intellectual competence. This is not a practical competence. It's not something you practically, physically do. It's an intellectual thing. So at this stage, I'm going to distinguish two lines of argument that I'm running. There's the one I have run so far, which is the argument from ineffectiveness, which is that much medicine was or is perhaps ineffective. And medical experts can't always cure, and this means that the curative thesis is false. The second line of argument concerns multiple traditions. So it strikes me that if cure was the core medical competence, then we wouldn't probably have multiple traditions in the way that we do, persisting alongside each other. Effective cures would dominate, like effective modes of transport tend to dominate, and depending on what you can afford, and that would be what it would come down to. But that's not how it works. Multiple traditions do persist. So I mentioned Sangomas. I'm going to talk also a little briefly about homeopaths. In the UK, there are more consultations of alternative practitioners than there are of mainstream doctors every year. So it's not just that they sort of persist in a minor way. I mean, they persist in a big way. So why should that be? I think if you endorse the curative thesis, you're going to end up saying it's basically error. People are just hoping for cures that they can't get. But the problem with that, apart from anything else, apart from arguments that I'm about to put to the contrary, is that you then have to say something about oncology and psychiatry and cardiology and all the other things where we have limited success. And it seems to me to do anything else is Whiggish. So let me then ask whether there are things that mainstream medicine can't explain, reasons that one might consult more widely. I'm going to talk briefly about Sangomas. So Sangomas are neither particularly traditional nor healers, as those terms are usually used. So this is one of the initial things that's difficult here is the term traditional healer is often used, but it's arguably not very accurate. Sangomas understand themselves as belonging to an intellectual tradition of which healing is just one part. So here the emphasis is on, that I want to place, is on the words intellectual tradition, because that suggests that it's an inquiry and that understanding is crucial. Divination in particular, which this is a picture of, has this kind of shared inquiry aspect And then herbal remedies often don't have a pharmacological purpose, and when you read the literature on this stuff, that's often stressed. It's seen as naive to just suppose that people are thinking, oh well, you know, this herb is going to have a sort of direct pharmacological action. I mean, sometimes that's the point, but often it's not. So Sangomas are not wholly engaged in healing, and they are partly engaged in attaining or providing understanding. That's what I'm drawing from this. So then the question arises: what questions might a Sangoma be answering that a mainstream medic cannot? And I mean contentful questions. I don't mean, you know, I'm not trying to be too sort of, you know, touchy-feely about this. I don't mean like, you know, it's going to make people feel good or something. I mean, what actually contentful questions could people be getting different answers from different traditions, or could people find they were unable to pose in one tradition but able to in another? And for this is the only slightly technical bit of the talk, technical in a philosophical sense. I'm going to introduce the notion of contrastive causal explanation to give you a sense of how you could have different kinds of contentful answers to different meaningful questions. It's not just a kind of relativism that I'm endorsing here. So, often when we explain, we cite causes. And often when we cite causes, we use contrasts to specify the cause we're interested in. So take the question, why did you arrive late? I didn't see you coming. I was going to pick on somebody who came in. I didn't see. It's obviously absorbed. And why did you arrive late? Well, suppose a common way to answer that question is to cite a cause of your late arrival. But there are lots of those, including, for example, the presence of oxygen in the air, which you're breathing. So you might respond by, saying, well, there was oxygen in the air, which sustained me during my journey and kept me in fine health until I arrived, and here I am. At which point, before you launched into your lecture on the lungs, I'd stop you and say, no. I mean, why were you late rather than on time? To which the answer might be, oh, well, I was, having a glass of something strong to get me through the tedious lecture. So the point about that is a cause, they're both causes of your late arrival, but having a glass of something strong is a causal difference between your late arrival and your arrival on time. It's different. It's a cause of late arrival which is absent from the on-time arrival. Whereas the presence of oxygen is a cause in both cases. So it can't answer that second question, why were you late rather than on time? So often we explain by citing a cause. It's not just any cause, it's got to be a relevant one. And often the way you make clear which is the relevant cause is that you specify a contrast, and perhaps even more often you don't specify the contrast, it's just implied, as of course it is in this first one. I mean, when you ask somebody why they arrived late, you don't expect them to give you, a history of their, the family tree or, the Big Bang or something. So, mainstream medicine is kind of Vitruvian. This is Leonardo da Vinci's famous Vitruvian Man. It's it focuses on the human body and that in great detail and very little outside it. It concerns the individual human body, and it offers explanations in terms of things that operate in or on the human body or through the human body, the individual human body. The classic piece of evidence in medicine is the case study, the individual case. The person showed up with spots, and then they got a fever, and then 3 days later they died, and you report that. No control, no comparator. And the contrast classes are those of biology, basically. So the normal cell, the normal heart. So my thought is, maybe there's a different range of contrasts that you can countenance in different traditions. Sangomas, for example, can countenance a different range of contrasts that just aren't countenanced in the mainstream medicine paradigm. So what that means is that, if that's correct, that it's possible to frame questions that just aren't frameable within the mainstream medicine, within the mainstream paradigm. It isn't a question of having competing answers to the same questions. It's a question. I mean, it's a question of having different questions. You might be trying to explain the same health fact, but your foil, the contrast you're drawing, is different between the two. and you might be looking at social or political or spiritual explanations. So there are Western critiques of mainstream medicine that are in the same vein. So most famously, I think, we have social epidemiologists who point out that you can't understand differences in health between social groups within the paradigm of mainstream medicine. You can't understand the fact that, you know, somebody with a PhD lives longer than somebody without, just by looking at the biology of the human body. You have to look at social facts as well. And that's a, you know, that's a hot political topic, and it's a hot topic about the scope of medicine as well. There are historians who have argued as well that you can't attribute the growth of population and improvement of health to improvements in clinical medicine, and similarly, there are epidemiologists who just doubt that clinical medicine is the main, or at least the most efficient policy tool. I mean, if a government wants to improve the health of the country, they tend to plough their money into medicine, but the evidence suggests that you're better off ploughing your money into getting people jobs and educating them than ploughing it into hospitals, because those things are more powerful determinants of population health at the population level. And then there's the evidence-based medicine movement, which basically insists that you need population-level evidence across all interventions. So, I've argued that Sangomas might be able to frame contrasts that can't be framed in mainstream medicine. But what about traditions that set themselves up in direct opposition? And remember I said it's not about, there I was saying you don't necessarily have to have competing answers. You can have the same fact being contrasted with different foils, and thus different causes being appropriate to mention in answer to it. But there are traditions that also set themselves up in direct, deliberate opposition. The most famous of these, and the most interesting in many ways, is homeopathy. Historically, it was set up as an alternative. The term homeopathy is contrasted with allopathy, which is what's used to describe the main, the mainstream tradition that it's disagreeing with. And it projects the worldview. Kuhn uses homeopathy as an example of a different paradigm. It simply rejects the worldview of homeopathy. Now, the effectiveness of homeopathy is hotly debated because it's very hard to reconcile homeopathy with chemistry, and it's hard to find evidence of effectiveness. So I'm not going to get into that. What I do want to say is that the driver for homeopathy, for interest in homeopathy, and for many other alternatives, is dissatisfaction with the dominant paradigm. So again, you might be dissatisfied with the contrasts that the paradigm is able to frame, the questions that you're able to ask within it, and that might make you look at something else. And I don't think you have to decide. People get distracted by this stuff, like, is it effective or not? I actually don't think that really matters all that much in the big picture. The point is that you don't have to accept the alternative to see that there is pressure on the dominant paradigm. So, I talked about the core intellectual competence as being understanding, and the core practical competence, I think, is prediction. And there's a link with understanding, because I think the way that you demonstrate understanding is by predicting. It's not by doing what I'm doing now, and sort of talking and using long words and so forth, being sort of having an honour conferred upon you. It's by the ability to predict. At least that's the only empirical test. So consider again the finger, the incurable finger. The way we can tell that the doctors know what's going on is that they predict accurately what happens to this finger and other ones like it. And then similarly with the doctor in that picture I showed you, the doctor can predict how the child is doing, whether the child's going to make it. And if they can do those things, that it's not cut and dry, but it's a strong piece of evidence for the claim that they understand what's going on. So aside from that, I have two short arguments concerning prediction. One is, both of them to the effect that prediction is prior to cure. So you might think, oh, no, surely the practical competence of medicine is to cure. Well, historically, diagnostic abilities certainly predated our curative abilities. We could predict before we could cure. We could diagnose before we could cure, obviously, and diagnosis typically enables prognosis. before it enables the cure. We can predict what's going to happen to somebody before we're necessarily, somebody's got tuberculosis, we were able to predict what would happen to them fairly reliably before we were able to do much about it. Specifically tuberculosis, a lot was known about that before we were able to do anything about it. And then logically, cure implies predicting the outcome of the intervention. Otherwise, you're just giving people pills at random. That's not, I take it that if you say you've cured somebody, you give them something and you predict that they're going to get better as a consequence. Not just that, but it also implies counterfactual prediction about what would have happened had you not given it to them. So here, there's a widespread belief that if you have a cold and you take vitamin C, it'll help you get better. The trouble with that is that there's a lot of evidence that's actually nothing to it at all, and very little evidence that it does work. But the reason it seems to work is that a typical cold lasts 3 days. On the first day you feel ill, then you go and get yourself some vitamin C, take it on the second day, and on the third day you start to feel better. But so you infer that the vitamin C has cured you. But the point is that you've got to be sure of the counterfactual. You've got to be sure about what would have happened had you not taken the vitamin C. So, in order to say that something has been a cure, you've not just got to get the person better. You've also got to be able to reliably say that they wouldn't have gotten better otherwise. So, I'm basically done. Cure is not the core medical competence. So that's my sort of negative conclusion. My first positive conclusion is that providing understanding is the core intellectual competence, and predicting is the core practical competence. Sort of bigger picture things, part of what I'm trying to do here is re-intellectualize medicine. So not see it as a merely practical tradition. I'm thinking of it as something that's not, particularly in the clinical world, it's very hard-nosed. We want to know what works, and I think what I'm trying to do is suggest that it may make sense to think of it as more explicitly as an intellectual tradition as well as a practical one. I also want to resist the kind of medical positivism that you see. So there's a view that, as I said, everything's got to be tested. Unless you can demonstrate effectiveness in a randomized controlled trial, you should be doubtful. And I'm trying to resist that, which is almost like old logical positivism. It's like anti-theory. It's explicitly anti-theory, and I'm trying to sort of resist that as well. It also strikes me that there might be new avenues for empirical research here, because all the empirical research on medicine of any kind focuses on testing the effectiveness of interventions. But if what I'm suggesting is correct, and the core practical competence is the ability to predict, well, that's something else that you could test. And we don't have really, we haven't looked at the predictive success of sangomas and predictive success of homeopaths or predictive success of chiropractors. So there's actually a way of an avenue for empirical research that I think might be kind of refreshing across a range of traditions. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Thaddeus Metz. I'm a research professor in the Department of Philosophy here at the University of Johannesburg. I'm one of Dean Broadbent's colleagues. And I've got about 5 or 6 minutes to respond to his inaugural address. First thing I'd like to do is congratulate him on it. In it, he defended a punchy, bold thesis, backed it up with some powerful argumentation, and made it accessible to a wide audience, not just philosophers. Beyond congratulating him, though, I want to set the talk in some context, provide some indication of how the talk fits into Dean Broadbent's career and the field more generally, and then I want to offer a few critical remarks about the talk. I've actually been encouraged to provide the critical remarks. I'm not just being a jerk in doing so. And furthermore, philosophers generally want some kind of critical perspective from their interlocutors. I have no doubt that Dean Broadbent really wants to know what I think about his ideas, and so I'm going to tell him. In terms of context, I see this talk as marking a divide between two major projects in Professor Broadbent's career. On the one hand, what he's accomplished most, as he mentioned at the start of his talk, has been in the field of philosophy of epidemiology. When I was a grad student some 25 years ago, I studied philosophy of physics, I studied philosophy of social science, but there wasn't any philosophy of epidemiology at that time to study. Now there is, and in large part because of Professor Broadbent's work. He's done the work of crystallizing epidemiology, the study of public health, into a distinct subfield in the philosophy of science. He's convinced the field that the study of public health has its own logic, its own philosophical problems when it comes to thinking about causation, evidence, explanation, and the like. A real accomplishment. As he indicated, he's in transition, moving from that aspect of philosophy of medicine to something more broad, philosophy of medicine more generally. And here too, I see him as consolidating and driving and taking some mastery over what is a fairly new discipline. Philosophers have thought about medicine for a while, but if you go back 50 years, it's the 1970s or so, we've spent a lot of time thinking about bioethics on the one hand, and we've also thought about the nature of health and disease on the other. And there are intricate theories that are bad but still quite alive out there on that topic. Implicit in Professor Broadbent's talk this evening is a kind of mapping of new conceptual categories and research projects in the philosophy of medicine that transcend bioethics on the one hand and thought about the nature of health and disease on the other. So implicit in the talk for me, when I heard it, I heard these different questions. One, what is medicine? Two, what is a medical expert? Three, what is it for medicine to have competence in something? Four, what is the purpose of medicine? What might we want out of it? And a fifth one, not mentioned quite as often, was justification. Why should we spend so much resources or pay so much attention to medical issues? Simply distinguishing these questions and pursuing their independent logics and thinking about how these various issues relate to one another, as some of which we've seen today, you start to see, you get a glimpse of the consolidation of a new field of philosophy of medicine. So that's the significance of the talk. I now have a few comments to help Professor Broadbent on his way. To sum up the talk briefly, Dean Broadbent's overarching question was, what is medicine? And he suggested that to answer that question, we should look at what medicine does well, what its competence is. And he furthermore suggests that curing isn't the competence of medicine. It doesn't do that particularly well. Instead, what it does well, intellectually, is offer understanding, and practically, it enables us to predict future outcomes. And so the essence of medicine, by the logic of this argument, is that it's a matter of facilitating understanding and prediction. That's the argument in a nutshell. Here are two ways one might cast doubt on the argument. First, I worry that the reason Professor Broadbent has given us for doubting that cure is a core competence of medicine might apply with equal or comparable force to his alternative suggestion about understanding. So the powerful argument for rejecting the idea that cure is a core competence of medicine is to point to this long history of the medical field. Right? Professor Broadbent points out we've got a few thousand years of medical practice, but we've done a really bad job of curing during that time. Maybe we've gotten better recently, but in the past we had medicine, but we had medicine without cure. I'm concerned that a similar kind of argument applies to understanding. Right? So we've had various attempts to understand, various theories of what's going on for a couple thousand years, but they sucked by and large, but we still had medicine. Right? So the explanations we've had up until fairly recently have been things like, well, you got sick because the gods are angry at you, or there was the humor theory that there's an imbalance of fluids in the body and that leads to thoughts that you have too much bile or too much blood and so we have to bloodlet. There was the miasma theory of the plague, that it's the invisible vapors in the air that we can't see that are causing the plague. That was the so-called understanding we had for many generations. But that's not understanding. Right? Usually when we use the word understanding, it's what philosophers call a success term. It suggests we got knowledge as opposed to false or unwarranted beliefs. So the cute, cheeky way to put my concern is that the best explanation of why we haven't been able to cure is that we haven't been able to understand, at least in one sense of understanding. And I look forward to Dean Broadbent clarifying what he means by understanding to try to wiggle out of this problem I've posed. Second way I want to question Dean Broadbent's argument concerns the conclusion. The conclusion is that, in answer to the question of what is medicine, the answer for him is the essence of medicine includes the abilities to understand what's going on with a patient and to predict what's going to happen to him or her. Here's a counterexample. Here's a counterexample where it looks like I'm doing something medical, but I'm neither understanding nor predicting. Right? So suppose, hypothetically, that I were in touch with an oracle. Right? And whenever I would consult with the oracle would give me the right answer about various health conditions. So if I would ask about Dean Broadbent's health or what disease he's got, I would consult the oracle. I'd reach in my pocket and pull out a piece of paper. I'd open up the piece of paper, and on it would read the relevant disease. Suppose further that upon getting news of what the disease is, that I ask the oracle for curative powers. And I say, please, when I touch Professor Broadbent with my finger, cure him. And whenever I do this with Professor Broadbent or anybody else, the oracle tells me the truth on the piece of paper about what's wrong with the person, and indeed gives me curative powers with my finger. And suppose I've done this thousands of times successfully. Suppose furthermore that I don't really understand what's written on the paper. Well, there's some line about what his disease is, some technical Latin name that I don't understand. But it's true, it's accurate. And suppose I can't predict what's going to happen to any one of you with the disease you've got. I don't have that kind of expertise. But I can cure you, and I can identify your problem, and I can do so reliably. Seems like I'm doing something medical, even though I don't understand what the issue is with you, and even though I can't predict what's going to happen to you. So I'm concerned that the suggestion that understanding and prediction are necessary or essential to medicine is too strong. Looks like we can have other things that make something medical. I suspect Dean Broadbent might distinguish between the medical on the one hand and medical expertise on the other. He might suggest I lack the latter, which would be plausible. Another reply he might give alludes to the very first slide of his talk, that he's interested in philosophy making a practical difference and being relevant to this world. So the natural thing for him to say might be, well, Metz, you're not in touch with an oracle, nor will you be in touch with an oracle. In this world, medicine isn't a matter of simply being able to identify a disease and being able to cure. In this world, what's essential to medicine is rather understanding somebody's condition and being able to predict what is going to happen to them. And that begs the larger philosophical question of what it is to ask the question, what is medicine? Are we interested in an account that applies to all possible worlds, ones that include oracles, or are we rather just interested in the nature of a certain practice in this world? Good philosophy doesn't have the last word on things. It's not what makes something a good philosophical talk. A good philosophical talk is one that prompts many more words. And I've had a few over the past 5 or 7 minutes or so. And I also have no doubt that many others in the field are going to have things to sink their teeth into, not only with this talk, but Professor Broadbent's larger project in the philosophy of medicine. And that's an awful lot to be proud of.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Chad, and I'm doing a doctoral project under the supervision of Alex on prediction in economics. And I was also going to start with an apology because the notion of an outright endorsement is foreign to us, so I decided to compromise and give half an endorsement. So what I'll do, because Thad already gave a broad strokes account of the talk, is zoom in on something specific where I have questions for Alex. And what I want to zoom in on is what he refers to as the argument from multiple traditions. So he draws attention to the fact that there are these people or communities of people who consult both mainstream or Western medicine as well as traditional medicine or alternative medicine. And in the local context, the obvious example is the Sangoma. So the question is, why would people do that? And in the work he cites, the Thornton work, it's pointed out that this isn't sort of the poor man's alternative to mainstream medicine. Okay? These things cost money. So what would prompt someone to pay twice for what looks like the same service? And I think Professor Broadbent does a good job of explaining what would prompt someone to make that decision from the perspective of someone whose default position has been to consult mainstream doctors. You give an explanation about how consulting a Sangoma or a homeopath broadens the possible explanations available to you and therefore broadens understanding. But my first question to him is whether he considers the same question from the opposite perspective. So from the perspective of a person or a community of people who come from having only traditional healers or only alternative medicine and who now start consulting mainstream or Western medicine. The question is, what is it about mainstream medicine that would prompt you to start doing that, if not the possibility of another possible cure? What is it about the explanation that mainstream medicine gives that adds on to what you already know? Especially given something else he says about the limitation of the explanation available to the mainstream doctor. So the point's made that unlike a mainstream doctor, a Sangoma can draw on explanations that deal with the spiritual, with the social, all of these other things. So the question is, why would you then pay extra for an explanation that seems more impoverished in terms of the things it can refer to? The second point I want to bring up is related to the notion of prediction. And one of the omissions I noticed is that when you look at the literature on prediction, one of the important aspects that comes out a lot is that prediction is invariably a probabilistic thing. So if I can refer back to the explanation of the finger that falls off in 3 days, it's very rare that you ever get a prediction like that. And more typically, what you would be given is the explanation of the prediction that your finger is likely to fall off, or there's an 80% chance of your finger falling off in 3 days. So what I wanted to ask is, if a doctor gave you that type of prediction, and it turned out that your finger in fact did not fall off, so the 20% scenario happens, does that mean you have not shown medical competence, or have you still shown medical competence? And if it's the case that a false prediction can still display medical competence, then I would question your argument that the best way, empirical way of showing understanding is through prediction. So because of those two things, considered from the perspective of someone whose default position is traditional or alternative medicine, looking at the alternative of mainstream medicine, what I think becomes obvious is that it's maybe a bit more difficult than you think to dismiss the possibility that the real motivation behind having both cures, or both purported cures, is simply a case of hedging bets. So I'll pay double with the hope that one of the cures takes hold and I get better. So with that question, I'll leave it, and thank you.
You will all agree with me that he introduced many ideas that will allow us to reflect as we move forward. I was once told that prediction is nothing more than rearrangement of information that already exists. And I think Sangomas do a little bit of that. When I decided to do a postdoctoral fellowship, my aunt was so disturbed that she went and not only consulted a Sangoma, she actually consulted 3 Sangomas. And she wanted to find out what was going on in my head. And of course she thought it was not appropriate for me to do that. With those few words, I'm glad to invite you to come for cocktails on the other side, and you can be able to engage Professor Broadbent further on some of the ideas that he has put forward. Thank you very much. I will request all of you to stand for the procession to depart.
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.